You are listening to Jewish History from the Inside Out, an analysis of Chazal in the context of conventional history. This Chanukah series is dedicated in loving memory of Shneir Zalman Olav HaSholem ben Harav Menachem Mendel Sheyichya. May his memory be a blessing. Welcome to Jewish History from the Inside Out, the Chanukah series, Episode 4. In this episode, we finally resolve the two conflicting accounts of the Chanukah story. Episode 4 is much longer and more involved than the previous episodes, and has therefore been divided into two parts. The first part picks up the story of Yehuda and his brothers where we left off at the end of Episode 2. We will discuss in detail the events that occurred in the 15 years after the Holy Temple was restored and the services resumed, and then provide a brief overview of the decade that followed. The second part will then proceed to reconcile the secular account with that of Chazal, and hand us a brand new understanding and appreciation of the Chanukah miracle and of that entire era. But first, an important digression. As mentioned in Episode 1, there are essentially two secular accounts of the wars of the Maccabees that are recorded in the two books of Maccabees. These accounts are contained also in Josephus and Yosiphon, a book based largely on Josephus. These last two, however, cannot be considered independent sources, as Josephus follows Maccabees 1, for the most part chapter and verse, and Yosiphon closely aligns with Maccabees 2, with minor discrepancies. Yosiphon also suffers from multiple scribal errors, and in a number of cases it appears he misunderstood the somewhat confusing text of Maccabees 2. The two accounts diverge on many, many important points. Although the general historical arc is the same, they differ widely on the order of events, names of people involved, sizes of armies and casualties suffered, and even on the occurrence of major wars. I emphasize this because as we are going to try and reconcile the secular account with Chazal, we must recognize that there are multiple secular accounts that are to some degree irreconcilable. In many ways, it is harder to integrate the secular accounts with each other than to reconcile them with Chazal. It is important also to bear in mind the particular biases each of these two accounts hold. Maccabees 1 and Josephus carry a nationalist and Hashmonoi dynastic bias, blatantly slanted in favor of Shimon the Maccabee in particular. This is to be expected, as it was his progeny from whom the Hashmonoi dynasty ultimately descended, and who presumably commissioned this work. It is interesting to note that Maccabees 2 describes a number of incidents where Shimon's army suffered losses, setbacks, and even committed treason, accounts all of which are absent from Maccabees 1. To be fair, some would argue that Maccabees 2 has an anti-Shimon bias, as it omits one or two of Shimon's victories and appears to delight in showcasing his failures. At any rate, we will present both sides in our retelling of the story. As in Episode 2, we will follow mainly the chronology presented in Maccabees 1 and Josephus, with the occasional tidbit from Maccabees 2 and Yosiphon. We have chosen this route for the simple reason that the former sources present a more coherent and easier to follow narrative. Still, as emphasized in Episode 2, there is exactly zero certainty that the history presented in Maccabees 1 and the story it tells is factually more accurate than Maccabees 2. Historians enjoin us always to approach the historical record with a healthy dose of skepticism, to account for biases and omissions, either deliberate or unintentional, and to juxtapose and check sources against each other. This is exactly what we will do. Rather than accept the secular accounts at face value, we will compare and contrast, at times preferring one account and at times another. The restoration of the Holy Temple did not put an end to the wars. In fact, the heaviest fighting occurred after the temple was rebuilt. Following the events described in Episode 2, Yehuda launched a series of military operations against predatory local forces to secure the borders of Israel and to rescue outlying Jewish communities. Afterwards, the Maccabees fought several wars against the Seleucid Empire proper, under Antiochus V, Eupator, and Demetrius I, Soter. The rescue campaign of Yehuda and his brothers is complex and full of confusing details and conflicting accounts. In the interest of clarity and brevity, I will suffice with a brief overview of the events and save the details for a supplementary episode at some point in the future with Hashem's help. Shortly after the temple is rebuilt and the Seleucid army expelled, the local powers begin harassing the Jews. Afraid to attack the Maccabees head-on, they take out their Jew hatred by attacking the Jews living in their vicinity. The Edomians can always be counted on to attack first. After all, it is a known halachic ruling that Esav, the progenitor of the Edomians, abhors Yaakov, the father of the Jewish people. The Edomians strike from the south. Next to attack are the Ammonites to the east, under the command of Timotheus, and finally the Phoenicians to the north. In each of these areas, there are defenseless Jewish settlements, and the local powers have begun terrorizing them. The Jews flee to the fortified cities. 1,000 of them have already been killed. Yehuda first defends the south, then sends Shimon to defend the north, and sets out with Yonasan to fight Timotheus in the east. The goal is to reach the Jews in those areas and bring them back to Judea, where they can be well protected. Shimon's mission is a success. He kills 3,000 Phoenicians and leads the Jews of Galil southward to safety. Yehuda fights a number of heavy battles and successfully rescues the Jews east and northeast of the Jordan River. Finally, he decisively eliminates the Edomian threat from the south and southwest. This campaign lasted all through the year 164 and 163 BCE. In the year 162, Yehuda decided to mount an attack on the Acra fortress. The fortress, which oversaw the Temple Mount, had been a thorn in the Jews' side for the last 5 years. Megillas Tainus, 23rd of Iyar, describes the situation. Quote, "The residents of the Acra fortress would harass the Jews of Jerusalem, and it was impossible to come and go to the temple by day, only at night." Having subdued the surrounding nations and having gained relative security, Yehuda decided the time had come to conquer the Acra. He besieged the fortress and prepared to starve its inhabitants. One night, though, a number of Greeks snuck out of the fortress along with some of the Hellenists and the high priest Menelaus, and made their way to Antioch. The Hellenists pleaded with Antiochus to assist them against their fellow Jews. "For we desired faithfully to serve your father and heed his commands, but these people have attacked us. They have plundered our possessions and killed any one of us that has fallen into their hands. They have fought and overpowered the other nations under your rule. They have fortified the temple and the fortress of Beis Tzur. If you don't help us now, very soon they will conquer the Acra, and there will be no stopping them then." The young king was incensed and probably stomped his little foot and decided, it was probably Lysias who decided, to go to war. he gathered a huge army, far greater than any the Jews had ever faced. Although the two books of Maccabees usually disagree on the size of the armies in each of the wars, with Maccabees 2 usually providing a much higher count. On this battle, they are almost in agreement. There were approximately 100 to 110 foot soldiers and between 10 and 20,000 horsemen, plus 32 elephants. According to Maccabees 1, this was the first time the Maccabees had ever faced elephants in battle. The elephants utilized by the Greeks in battle were huge. Atop each sat a turret that carried 4 archers and a driver. Each elephant was surrounded by 500 horsemen and 1,000 foot soldiers. Before going into battle, they would get the elephants drunk so that they would charge at the enemy without fear. The effect was unnerving. In the Treaty of Apamea, struck between Antiochus III and the Roman Empire, the Seleucids had renounced the use of elephants in war. Still, Antiochus, or Lysias, decided it was worth incurring the wrath of the Romans to secure a decisive victory against the Maccabees. The Seleucids set out for Jerusalem in late 163 or early 162 BCE. They took the same route as last time, the coastal road down south to Ashkelon, turning east toward Hebron and approaching Jerusalem from the south. The army arrived at the fortress of Beis Tzur. They erected towers and set up battering rams and besieged the fortress, but the Jews inside fought heroically and would sneak out and burn down their war machines. Yehuda realized that he would have to give up the siege of the Acre fortress for the time being to deal with the oncoming Seleucid army. He led his men south to Beis Zechariah, an area right between Jerusalem and Beis Tzur, and set up camp. The road to Beis Zechariah ran between 2 mountains, and rather than spread out the elephants alongside each other, the army moved in a column between the mountains, with one elephant and its entourage following the next. The rest of the army spread out over the 2 mountains, their bronze shields glistening in the sun. The mountains gave off a mighty echo, and when the soldiers shouted their battle cries, it reverberated like a thunderous roar. The Maccabees had never faced an army of this size or strength before. The 2 armies clash. Yehuda wins the first volley, killing 600 Seleucid soldiers. Still, the enemy rumbles on inexorably. Elazar, sensing the mood of the Jewish army, decides to risk his life to turn the tide of war. He spots the tallest elephant and figures it must be carrying the king himself. If he could reach it and kill the king, the rest of the army would be thrown into disarray and the Maccabees might stand a chance. And so, Elazar breaks rank and charges into the fray, slaughtering Greeks left and right until he reaches the elephant. Then, taking his spear, he pierces the belly of the elephant, which topples over, crushing him underneath. The king was not on that elephant, and although Elazar had shattered the illusion of the elephant's invulnerability, it was not enough to push the Jews to victory. Yehuda assessed the situation and decided to retreat to Jerusalem. Antiochus then sent part of the army to resume the siege on Beis Tzur, and the rest to Jerusalem to attack the Temple Mount. It was a sabbatical Shemitah year, and food was scarce. Eventually, the Jews inside the fortress of Beis Tzur surrendered to Antiochus, after he had promised not to harm them. The Seleucids erected all kinds of war machines to try and conquer the Temple Mount, but Yehuda and his men repelled them at every turn. However, unbeknownst to the Seleucids, the Maccabees' provisions were dwindling, and one by one, Yehuda's men slipped out of the temple to scrounge for food. At the very last moment, when everything was all but lost, Antiochus received word that Philip, who had been appointed regent by Antiochus Epiphanes, was trying to usurp the monarchy. He had gathered up the army Epiphanes had taken to Persia and was vying for the throne. Realizing the severity of his predicament, Lysias convinced Antiochus to call a truce and hurry back to Antioch. After all, he said to the king, the temple is heavily fortified, and we are already short on food. And besides, the only reason the Jews rebelled in the first place is because they were prevented from keeping their laws. Let us allow them then to keep their laws and make peace. Yehuda agreed to the truce. The king was allowed onto the Temple Mount, but when he saw the fortifications, he broke his oath and had the fortifying wall raised. Then he returned to Antioch. This event is recorded in Megillas Tainus. Quote, on the 28th of Shvat, King Antiochus was removed from Jerusalem. He had come to destroy the city and annihilate the Jews, but he received bad news, and he left, and was killed in that place, i.e. Antioch, as we will see shortly. Antiochus and Lysias traveled to Antioch in the year 162 to fight Philip. On the way home, sick and tired of Menelaus and his constant badgering and incitement, Lysias advised Antiochus to do away with him once and for all. According to Maccabees 2, Menelaus was sent to Beroia, where there was a kind of creepy execution machine that functioned as follows. The victim was placed on a pulley that drew him up a tower 50 cubits high and then dragged him down into a pile of ashes to meet his death. According to Josephus, Philip was killed on the order of Lysias. According to Maccabees 2, he fled to Ptolemy Philometor, king of Egypt. It's all the same to us. Antiochus reasserted himself as king of the Seleucid Empire, but not for long. Antiochus's gamble and illegal use of elephants had piqued the Romans, and they sent an ambassador, Octavius, to sink the Seleucid navy and cripple their elephants. The king and Lysias were afraid to protest against Rome, but the wild mob in Antioch was so incensed that they killed Octavius. Upon receipt of the news, the Roman Senate convened and held Antiochus responsible for Octavius's death. Now you may recall that Demetrius, the son of Seleucus IV, had been exchanged for his uncle Mithridates, Antiochus Epiphanes, as a hostage in Rome. His father had been king, and his uncle had ascended the throne after him. That was all well and good, but Demetrius was not about to relinquish his claim to the throne to his young cousin, all of 11 years. He had petitioned the Senate in the past to allow him to return to Antioch and claim his heritage, but his request had been rejected. The Romans preferred the young and weak Antiochus to the 23-year-old Demetrius. Now, with Antiochus's fleet destroyed and his elephants crippled, Demetrius again appealed to the Senate. Again, his request was denied. This time, Demetrius decided to take matters into his own hand. He gathered a group of his closest friends, including a man by the name of Nicanor, and boarded a ship for Tripoli. By the time the Romans discovered his escape 4 days later, he was well on his way, and they decided not to pursue him, but rather to wait and see how things played out. After disembarking at Tripoli, Demetrius got himself an army of mercenaries and marched on Antioch. The people were so unhappy with Antiochus and Lysias that they delivered them up to Demetrius, who refused even to look at them and ordered them killed. Then he sent the murderers of Octavius to be prosecuted in Rome. The Romans were pleased with his conduct, but did not entirely trust him, and throughout his reign they tacitly supported anyone and everyone who attempted to undermine it. How do we have all this information about Demetrius's rise to power? Well, one of Demetrius's friends and advisors was a man by the name of Polybius, who just happened to be a Greek historian and recorded it. We ought to bear in mind, though, what scholars have long acknowledged, that, like all good historians, Polybius wrote favorably of his friends and disparagingly of those he disliked. Now, there was a man by the name of Alcimus, or Iachimus, who desired to be Kohen Gadol. It's not entirely clear who he was, where he came from, and what claim he had to the high priesthood. Maccabees 2 says, quote, he had been Kohen Gadol in the past, but had willingly defiled himself in the days of Antiochus IV, when he realized that he had no access to the high priesthood. However, Alcimus does not appear in the historical record prior to this time. Josephus claims he had been appointed by Antiochus Eupator after Menelaus was killed, which is highly improbable. At that time, Antiochus and Lysias had other things on their minds, and besides, Yehuda and the Maccabees were in control of the temple and would never have allowed it. Maccabees 1 states simply that he was a leader of the Hellenists who had designs on the high priesthood. At this point, Maccabees 1 and 2 diverge. I will present first the account given in Maccabees 1 and Josephus, and then the account from Maccabees 2 and Yesiph. Alcimus complained to Demetrius that Yehuda and his men had expelled the Hellenists from the land and had killed many of the king's allies. Send one of your most trusted men and see for yourself, he said to the king. So the king sent Bacchides, in the words of Josephus, a dignified man, a friend of Antiochus Epiphanes, an oxymoron if there ever was one, who ruled over all of Mesopotamia. Demetrius placed an army under his command and sent Alcimus with him to Judea, with orders to kill Yehuda and his men and instate Alcimus as Kohen Gadol. Bacchides arrived with a large army and tried to lure Yehuda into a trap. He sent messengers proffering peace and requested a meeting. Yehuda was alert to the discrepancy between Bacchides' words and the size of his army and refused to meet with him. Still, a number of Jewish scholars and pious men believed Bacchides when he swore that he would not harm them. After all, he was accompanied by Alcimus, a descendant of Aaron HaKohen. Surely he would not betray their trust. Yet, as soon as they came before Bacchides, he promptly murdered 60 of them. The populace was filled with fear. Bacchides had deceived them and had killed their leaders. Those who had been inclined to trust Bacchides fled after he had broken his oath. He pursued them to Bir Zeta and killed many of them and dumped their bodies in a mass grave. Then he instated Alcimus as Kohen Gadol and left him with a sizable army and returned to Antioch. Alcimus flattered the populace and gathered many adherents, mostly Hellenists. Anyone who was suspected of allying with Yehuda was killed. When Yehuda saw that Alcimus had gained control and had killed many of the faithful Jews, he launched a counterattack and killed a number of Alcimus's men. Seeing that he could not overpower Yehuda, Alcimus returned to Demetrius and asked for help. The king was afraid that things were about to really get out of hand, and so he sent his friend Nicanor, the anti-Semite, who had accompanied him on his escape from Rome, with a large army to Jerusalem. Like Bacchides, Nicanor pretended peace. He sent messengers to Yehuda and declared that he would come with a small number of men merely to communicate Demetrius's intentions to him. Yehuda believed him and received Nicanor, who had his men hidden nearby ready to ambush Yehuda. As they were sitting together, Nicanor signaled his men, but Yehuda realized the trap, ran back to his own soldiers, and fled Jerusalem. Now, abandoning all pretense, Nicanor fought Yehuda near Kfar Shalmo, but was beaten and lost around 500 men, and he fled to the Acra. The next day, Nicanor descended from the Acra to the Holy Temple. The Kohanim went out to greet him and showed him the sacrifices that had been offered for the king's welfare. Nicanor scoffed and mocked them, and he swore that if Yehuda was not soon delivered into his hands, that upon his return he would burn the temple to the ground. The Kohanim fell down before the altar and the sanctuary and prayed to God to deliver this wicked man into their hands and to avenge his sacred honor that had so been desecrated. Nicanor left Jerusalem and came to Beis Chorin, where he was met by the Syrian army. Yehuda was in the city of Chadasha, halfway between Jerusalem and Beis Chorin, with 3,000 men. He prayed to Hashem for assistance, and then he surprise attacked the enemy. Nicanor was the first to be killed, and his troops panicked and fled towards the coast. Yehuda pursued the enemy, and then something unusual happened. The citizenry from the surrounding villages and towns came out and attacked the fleeing Greeks from all sides, and the soldiers were caught in the middle. They tried to turn back, but ended up falling upon each other and killing one another, until not one of them remained. The Jews plundered Nicanor's camp and cut off his head and the arm he had waved against the temple, and hung them near Jerusalem. This occurred on the 13th of Adar, and it was declared a holiday from that day on. We pause at this juncture to present the alternative account from Maccabees 2. Alcimus arrives in Antioch in the year 161 BCE. He brings the king a golden crown and a palm tree, along with olive branches from the Holy Temple. He waits patiently until the king turns to him and asks how things are going in Judea. Ah, Alcimus sighs. The Jews, who are known as the pious ones, and who are led by Judah the Maccabee, persist in fighting the government and do not allow the country to rest. I have come here, firstly, to protect the king's interests, and secondly, to appeal on behalf of my people who have suffered so much at the hands of Yehuda and his men. Know that as long as he is alive, the land will know no peace. Demetrius and his men, who abhor the Jews, grow angry, and he sends Nicanor, who is in charge of the elephant guard, to remove Yehuda and install Alcimus as high priest. Nicanor arrives in Judea, and all of the Gentiles who had fled the Maccabees now band together and join him. When they hear of Nicanor's arrival, the faithful Jews begin to pray, and on Yehuda's command, Shimon goes to battle with Nicanor. Shimon falters, and when the Seleucids launch a full-scale assault, he is overwhelmed. Still, having heard of the bravery of Yehuda's men, Nicanor is afraid to fight an all-out war against him, and so he sends messengers and offers peace. A meeting is arranged, and Yehuda positions his men strategically in case Nicanor should try to pull any funny stuff. The meeting goes well, and Nicanor calls off his army. Nicanor and Yehuda grow close, and Nicanor encourages him to marry, which he does. Yosifun even ascribes him the birth of a son, Mazel Tov. Things are going so well between Yehuda and Nicanor that Alcimus is starting to get nervous. He travels back to Demetrius and tells him that Nicanor is scheming behind his back and is plotting with Yehuda against the king. The king sends a message to Nicanor telling him to hurry up and send Yehuda to Antioch in chains. Nicanor is in a bind, but he cannot disobey the king. Yehuda senses something is amiss and flees the city at night, traveling north toward the Gofna hills he knows so well. When Nicanor hears that Yehuda has escaped, he enters the Beis Hamikdash and demands the Kohanim deliver Yehuda up to him. They swear that they know nothing of his whereabouts. He then raises his right arm against the temple and swears, "If you do not hand me Yehuda in chains, I will raise this house to the ground and destroy the altar, and in its place I will build a temple to a pagan deity." Then he turns and leaves. The Kohanim immediately fall to the ground and call out to God, beseeching him that the temple that had only recently been restored not be desecrated once again. Now there is a man living in Jerusalem by the name of Razi, or Recrisius, and who had withstood unspeakable torture in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. Since he cannot capture Yehuda, Nicanor vents all of his wrath on Razi and sends 500 soldiers to arrest him. Rather than fall into their hands, Razi falls on his sword, but only manages to wound himself. The soldiers are already at his door, and he runs up to the roof and throws himself down upon the crowd and dies. There are more details to this account, but I have spared you the gory part. Nicanor decides to attack Yehuda on Shabbos. When the Jews who are forced to accompany him try to dissuade him from doing so, out of respect for the holiness of the day, Nicanor blasphemes and arrogantly laughs them off. Yehuda meanwhile encourages his men not to be afraid and tells them of a vision he had in which he beheld Yochanan Kohen Gadol along with the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. In his dream, Yirmiyahu hands him a golden sword and says, "Take this golden sword as a gift from God and smite the enemies with it." Yehuda prays to God to avenge his holy name and deliver the enemy into his hands. Yehuda leads his men into battle, and they destroy the enemy, killing no less than 35,000. They rejoice at the great miracle, and when the war is over, they return to find Nicanor dead upon his shield. There is great excitement and rejoicing, and the people offer thanks to God. Yehuda commands Nicanor's head and arm be cut off and brought to Jerusalem. He gathers everyone before the altar and sends for the people of the Acra fortress as well, and shows them the head and arm of Nicanor. He tears out Nicanor's tongue and throws it to the birds, and hangs his arm facing the sanctuary. Then he impales Nicanor's head on a stake facing the Acra fortress. The 13th day of Adar is declared a holiday. This concludes the account from Maccabees 2. There are many discrepancies between the two accounts, but the two that stand out are as follows. Firstly, according to Maccabees 1, it is Bacchides who installs Alcimus as high priest, and the story of Nicanor occurs only later. While according to Maccabees 2, it is Nicanor who tries to install Alcimus, and there is no mention of Bacchides at all. Secondly, according to Maccabees 1, Nicanor tries immediately to deceive Yehuda, whereas in Maccabees 2, things start off okay and only fall apart later. It is interesting to note that the second book of Maccabees ends here with the story of Nicanor. Recall that Maccabees 2 is an abridgment of a 5-volume work by Jason of Cyrenaica. Whether the original concluded here as well, or only the abridged version, is immaterial, someone decided that this would be a good place to conclude the story of the Maccabees. From this point on, we have only Maccabees 1 and the book of Josephus to rely upon. And now, back to the story. After Nicanor was killed, things were quiet for a short time. Yehuda took advantage of this and struck a treaty with the Romans. The treaty stated that the Romans would come to the Jews' aid should they be attacked by hostile forces, and vice versa, and stated also that the Romans had rebuked Demetrius for harassing their allies, the Jews. According to Gichon and Herzog, this pact was a political misstep for Yehuda. Although potentially it would now be more dangerous for the Seleucids to attack Judea, the pact with Rome had the unintended consequence of precipitating the very thing it endeavored to prevent. You see, a guerrilla army, even one of the Maccabees' bravery and zeal, could be stomached by the Seleucids, since, contrary to Alcimus's posturing, it did not in actuality pose a military threat to Antioch. But an independent country, aligned with Rome, was perceived as a much greater threat. Nicanor dead, the king now sent Bacchides with Alcimus back to Judea for the second time with a large army. They massacred the city of Arbel, and in Tishrei of the year 163 set up camp outside Jerusalem. Yehuda was in the city of Elisha, and Bacchides led a force of 20,000 men and 2,000 cavalry there. Yehuda had 3,000 men with him, but when they beheld the size of Bacchides' army, they grew weak, and many of them fled, leaving Yehuda with only 800 men. Yehuda encouraged the remaining troops to fight. They tried to reason with him, and explained that it would make more sense to retreat and gather a larger army to fight the enemy. But Yehuda refused. "Heaven forbid I should do such a thing and flee from battle," he said. "And if our time has come, let us die honorably for the sake of our brethren and not leave a stain on our name." The Seleucid army was divided into two, with Bacchides on the right flank. Yehuda noticed this and immediately attacked it, adhering to the principle that had worked for him successfully in the past, to set everything else aside and destroy the leader as soon as possible. The attack was successful, and the right flank broke, with Yehuda and his men in hot pursuit. However, the attack against the left flank was unsuccessful, and Yehuda soon found himself being pursued by the remainder of the army. Suddenly, Bacchides turned, and Yehuda was caught between the two flanks. A harsh battle ensued, and in the end, after he had fought bravely and killed many, Yehuda fell, and the rest of the Jews fled. Yonasan and Shimon retrieved his body, and he was buried in the family plot in Moidin. The next section in Maccabees and Josephus is very important, and so I will quote Maccabees verbatim. Quote, "After Yehuda died, evildoers began to sprout up throughout the land, and all perpetrators of evil flourished. In those days there was a great famine, and the entire land surrendered to them," that is, to the Seleucids. Bacchides selected the evil traitors and appointed them rulers of the land. They searched and hunted down and destroyed all of Yehuda's allies, bringing them to Bacchides, who had them tortured and abused for his pleasure. Such a calamity had not befallen the Jewish people since the days of the prophets. End quote. Maccabees is telling us here that after Yehuda's death, the Hellenists grew in power, and because there was also a famine, the faithful Jews had no choice but to submit to the Hellenists and Bacchides. Yehuda's followers were hunted, tortured, and killed. Things got really bad. Just how bad? We do not know, for the book of Maccabees does not tell us. All we know is that things had not been this bad in a very, very long time. Eventually, the remnants of Yehuda's army approached Yonasan and requested he take Yehuda's place, since there was no one as worthy as he to continue leading the war effort. Yonasan accepted and assumed the mantle of leadership. When Bacchides heard of this development, he tried to kill Yonasan. Yonasan and Shimon had encamped in the desert, and Bacchides led his army around to the eastern side of the Jordan River and camped there, intending to attack on Shabbos. In the meantime, Yonasan sent his brother Yochanan, who the book of Maccabees calls the leader of the multitude, to the Nabatean Arabs to deposit their possessions with them while they fought Bacchides. But Yochanan was ambushed by the Arabs of Medva and was killed, and all of his possessions stolen. Not long thereafter, the Arabs of Medva were going to celebrate the wedding of a son of one of their chiefs. Yonasan and Shimon got word of it and hid out in the mountains. When the wedding procession passed them by, they ambushed it and killed everyone, and turned the wedding into a funeral, avenging the blood of their brother Yochanan. When Shimon and Yonasan returned from Medva, they camped near the Jordan, and Bacchides attacked on Shabbos. Surrounded on all sides, pressed between the army and the Jordan River, Yonasan encouraged the troops to call out to God in heaven and fight for their lives. The armies clashed, and Bacchides lost 1,000 men. At one point, Yonasan almost struck Bacchides, but he evaded the blow. Finally, Yonasan and his men had no choice but to jump into the river and swim across it. Bacchides did not pursue Yonasan across the Jordan, and the Jewish army escaped. Bacchides then fortified a number of cities and placed soldiers in each of them to harass the Jews, especially in the city of Beis Tzur. He also took the children of the Jewish leaders hostage to the Acra fortress. In the year 159 BCE, we are suddenly informed by the book of Maccabees, Alcimus orders the Seireg wall of the Temple Mount be destroyed, and the breaching of the wall begins. But then, out of the blue, Alcimus is struck by a mysterious illness and becomes paralyzed and dies before he is even able to write a will. I should mention that Josephus records this incident with Alcimus earlier, right after the death of Nicanor. When Bacchides saw that Alcimus had died, he returned to Antioch, and the land was quiet for 2 years. After 2 years, the Hellenists again reached out to Bacchides and told him that Yonasan had dropped his guard and that he and his men could be easily arrested in a single night. Bacchides sent a message to his friends in Judea to trap Yonasan and his men and hand them over to him. But the plot was uncovered, as Yonasan probably had spies among the Hellenists, and Yonasan killed around 50 of the Hellenist leaders. Yonasan and Shimon escaped once again to the desert and fortified the city of Beis Beitzoi. Bacchides called up his entire army and many of the Hellenists and laid siege to the city. The war lasted a long time. At some point, Yonasan snuck out of the city, leaving Shimon to hold the fort. He put together a second army and began capturing city after city until he reached Beis Beitzoi and attacked Bacchides' army from the rear. When Shimon saw that Yonasan had begun his attack, he led his men out of the city. They burned down all of Bacchides' war machines, and together the enemy was crushed. Bacchides was enraged at the traitors who had dragged him into this mess, and he killed many of them. Yonasan decided to call a truce and offered Bacchides a dignified withdrawal if he returned all of the captives. Bacchides agreed. He returned the captives, and he returned home, never to step foot again in the land of Israel. In the year 152, there was an internal struggle for the Seleucid monarchy. Alexander Balas, a man who claimed to be the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, launched a bid for the throne. The historian Polybius claims that Alexander was really a peasant boy from the city of Izmir, who had similar features to Antiochus Eupator. But Polybius is hardly a trustworthy source on this, as he was friends with Demetrius, and was known to cast aspersions on those he disliked, as mentioned earlier. Either way, both Alexander and Demetrius hoped to gain Yonasan's support. Demetrius was first to reach out. He granted Yonasan permission to raise an army, and commanded that all hostages in the Acra fortress be released. Yonasan took the letter and read it aloud to the people in the Acra. They were very frightened and immediately returned the hostages, and Yonasan set about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. All the Hellenists fled the fortified cities with the exception of the Acra and Beis Tzur. When Alexander heard that Demetrius had enlisted Yonasan, he sent his own messengers, promising him more power and confirming him as Kohen Gadol. Maccabees informs us that Yonasan donned the holy garments for the holiday of Sukkot in the year 152, implying that he had not held that position prior to that time. When Demetrius heard that Yonasan had switched sides and had aligned with Alexander, he sent another message promising him even more: exemption from taxes, the release of all Jewish slaves throughout his kingdom, territorial expansion of Israel, and generous donations to the Holy Temple. In the end, Yonasan chose Alexander. He did not forget all the treachery that had been wrought by Bacchides under the auspices of Demetrius, and he threw his wholehearted support behind his rival. The gamble paid off, as Demetrius was destroyed by Alexander Balas. Demetrius's forces fled, and he himself was killed. Josephus provides us with a romanticized account of Demetrius's demise. Quote, "Although all his men had fled, Demetrius fought on bravely. But as he was pursuing the enemy, his horse led him into a deep lake from which it was hard to extract himself, especially after his horse fell. He managed to climb out and continue fighting on foot, but his enemies surrounded him and pelted him with arrows until he fell." Let us now summarize the events of the 15 years or so that followed the restoration of the temple. First, Yehuda and his brothers execute a rescue campaign with the goal of saving the Jews of the nearby territories. Then, Yehuda lays siege to the Acra, but the Greeks and Hellenists residing there reach out to Antiochus, who arrives with a huge army that includes elephants. Elazar is killed in battle, and Yehuda retreats to the Holy Temple. At the last moment, Antiochus receives the news of Philip's rebellion. He lifts the siege and returns to Antioch, where he and Lysias are killed shortly thereafter by Demetrius. Alcimus approaches Demetrius and asks to be instated, or reinstated, as Kohen Gadol. According to Maccabees 1, Demetrius sends Bacchides to install Alcimus, and then Nicanor, when Yehuda undermines Alcimus's rule. You recall that according to Maccabees 2, it is Nicanor who is sent to install Alcimus. Nicanor is destroyed, and Demetrius sends, or resends, Bacchides with Alcimus to Israel. Yehuda is killed in battle, and after his death, all wickedness sprouts forth in the land, as many of his men are tortured and killed. At some point, Alcimus dies, having breached the Seirig wall of the Temple Mount. Yonasan assumes leadership of the rebels, and Bacchides tries twice to kill him. After the second time, they call a truce, and Bacchides leaves Israel, never to be seen or heard of again. Internal Seleucid politics impact Yonasan and the Jews of Israel, as Demetrius and his rival Alexander each vie for the Jews' support. Yonasan sides with Alexander, who is victorious, and Demetrius dies a hero's death. I will now give a brief overview of the decade that followed Demetrius' death. The next 10 years were full of upheaval and unrest for the Seleucid Empire. After having ruled for 5 years, Alexander is attacked by a coalition of Ptolemy VI of Egypt and Demetrius II, son of Demetrius I. Alexander is killed, and Demetrius is crowned king. Yonasan quickly switches sides and meets with Demetrius in Akko. Demetrius is impressed by Yonasan and reconfirms him as Kohen Gadol. Demetrius is soon deposed by the general Trypho and Antiochus, the young son of Alexander, and he flees to Seleucia, the secondary Seleucid capital. Yonasan switches his allegiance to Antiochus and is again confirmed by him as Kohen Gadol. Trypho intends to poison Antiochus and proclaim himself king, but he is afraid Yonasan would impede his plans due to his allegiance to Antiochus, and so he lays a trap for Yonasan and eventually kills him. Shimon, the last Maccabee brother, is appointed in place of Yonasan. Trypho does indeed kill Antiochus, and soon thereafter Shimon allies with Demetrius in Seleucia, and the land of Israel is granted full independence. In Maccabees 1, chapter 33, we read as follows. In the year 170, that is, the year 141 BCE, the yoke of the nations was lifted from the Jews, and all legal documents were dated as year 1 of Shimon the high priest, commander-in-chief and leader of the Jews. This verse is followed by a number of passages so effusive in their praise and adulation of Shimon and his wise counsel that they would make a car salesman blush. We are nearing the end of episode 4, part 1. At this point, it has probably dawned on you that the events contained in the scroll of Antiochus loosely correspond to the reign of Demetrius I, and that Nicanor and Bacchides, deputies of Demetrius, are the villains of the scroll. It appears we have been searching for the miracle of the oil in all the wrong places. So where do we go from here? At first glance, it may seem like we have only further complicated an already confusing story. There is still no mention of the miracle of the oil. Still no mention of Yochanan the high priest, nor of his daughter Hannah. And no mention of the evil decree of Prima Nocta. Besides, if Nicanor and Bacchides really are the villains of Chanukah, who then is the evil king Antiochus? All of this and much more will be resolved be'ezras Hashem in part